So this is Scott Kiloby, the founder of the Kiloby Center for Recovery, who is hosting this whole summit on radical recovery. And this is an opportunity for us to hear directly from him what it is that he feels is the most important in this issue and in this whole field of treatment. Now that the Kiloby Center for Recovery has been open almost 4 years, he has a lot that he's learned and that he'd like to share with us during this talk that I have today with him. So I'm Lynn Fraser. This is Scott Kiloby. Just go ahead, Scott.
Well, thanks for having me, Lynn, and from hosting this summit, which is amazing and really gets my juices flowing, as we sometimes say here at the center, because we love to create new ways of thinking and working with addiction. And this is a really wonderful format where we're pulled together, not just people from the Kiloby Center, but some amazing people to really talk about this perplexing issue of addiction and recovery.
One thing that we're asking people is, do you have a quote or a saying that you feel is important in your work or that guides you in your work?
You know, I don't have one particular quote or saying. There is something that we've been saying recently at the center, which is kind of new, which is, I'd have to really explain it, but it's the deeper or more core the story, the longer the gap. I have to kind of explain that. But it has to do with when we're triggered in our lives, emotionally triggered, we often either don't have the tool to remove the disturbance or dissolve the trigger, or if we have the tool, there's a gap in time that we wait to actually deal with it. We could carry it around for hours, days, months, or years, carrying that emotional weight around. So we say as you decrease the gap, in other words, you begin looking at something really quite quickly after the trigger happens, the more freedom that you feel from the story or from the suffering. And the deeper core stories are the deficiency stories that we talk about. So things like, I'm not good enough, I'm nothing, I'm inadequate, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable, unacknowledged. Those are very deeply held stories in our minds and bodies. And there tends to be a longer gap because they're so much a part of who we think we are that often we're actually operating from the story rather than aware of it. And so with those core stories, people tend to wait a while before they they don't know how to sort of remove that, or it'll take them a while. It'll be a long gap between the time they're triggered and they look. We're just trying to shorten that gap to give people a greater sense of freedom. So we kind of give them a fair warning, the deeper the story, the longer the gap, the more the suffering. So
right. Well, and when we're in the grip of a story like that, it feels terrible inside and terrifying.
yes.
So
Absolutely.
part of what you do there is give them the support that they can actually go into that experience and into that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of jumped really deep quickly there, to kind of get to it, but that it's kind of want to explain what is it that we do with that. But yeah, that's one motto. And I think, through the years, there have been many things that have helped me. But I don't carry a quote around per se and kind of live by that.
Right. Okay. Thanks. So how long have you been in the field of addiction and what brought you into it?
It depends on what you mean by in the field, because I was as early as 2007, I was working with people on addictive tendencies. And, I always tell people I've probably done 10,000 private sessions since then. And people were bringing to me all sorts of things like addictions to drugs and alcohol and sex and porn and caffeine and food. And so I was already working with them before I was sort of officially in the field. I could say, if you want to say officially in the field, is when the Kiloby Center opened as a certified addiction treatment center. And then I became an addiction specialist and certified in that. And I suppose that's the official. And that was a little over 4 years ago. But the background and experience that I had with working with all those people from all those countries in different places that were experiencing some of the same stuff was, profoundly helpful as I got into the treatment center space.
So you've spoken before about your own personal experience with addiction. Can you just say a little bit about that? And then that it must have been so interesting and part of your own recovery to be working with all of those other people on their recovery and seeing the patterns and how it works. And if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, my own story of addiction in sort of short form is I think I had the predisposition for addiction because of a family genetic history. Um, and it was sort of part of the culture of our family. You were either addicted or codependent. And you
Yeah.
fit in one of those two categories. So I remember from an early age being bullied as a kid and deeply traumatized by that, and immediately went to tobacco, and then right after that, marijuana and alcohol, and then eventually cocaine and meth, and then met my drug of choice at age 20, which were painkillers, opiates, and went on. You could say at least probably a 14, 15 year binge on those, and that culminated in. I'm skipping over a lot of pain. I'm not, it's not just that I was taking painkillers. There were tremendously shameful things that I was doing, stealing, um, trying to control my own drug use by locking my drugs away from me and trying to throw away the key, just crazy stuff to try to control something that was absolutely out of control. Um, a lot of suffering, a lot of hiding, um, a lot of lying. And then eventually, as I became an attorney in 2001, the worst years of my addiction were as the first 3 years of practicing law, which is a strange combination. And so at the third year of being an attorney, I just came to a point one day where I was looking, like every day, I was looking for painkillers. Where can I get them? Can I get them from a family member? Can I go steal them somewhere? Can I go to a doctor? And I had exhausted all my resources, and I opened the desk drawer of my office, and I saw one painkiller. And it was just in that moment, it was just a sort of an awakening, like that's never going to satisfy you. And no matter how many you have, you're never going to be satisfied. And something in me just woke up to the fact that I needed help. Luckily, I had a brother who had been in recovery many years. He came to my rescue and introduced me to recovery. But then, that's just part of the story, because through my journey of recovery and awakening, there's been secondary and process addictions to all sorts, everything that you can be addicted to, essentially: tobacco, caffeine, food, sex. Yeah, really anything. I mean, if you get even deeper, it's addiction to love, attention, praise, comfort.
Mm-hmm.
you know. It certainly didn't end by any means when I got clean and sober off drugs and alcohol.
So how does your awakening fit in with all of that?
I think I had the idea that if you have this enlightenment experience, and I think you know what I mean because you've had that somehow that's going to obliterate the entire tree of addiction, if you will. And what it does, I think, is it sets the foundation for that to start to happen, because then you're sort of awake and aware to things that were kind of hiding in your awareness, traumas, deficiency stories, anxiety, cravings. So I think what it does is just like turning the light on in a room that was otherwise dark. And as that light is turned on, then you can begin to explore the deeper strands of suffering that lie at the core of the addiction. So what it did for me, I will say that certainly there was a change when I kind of experienced that non-dual awareness, that there was a change towards just about everything in the sense of there was much less guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Even the cravings were much more, they were less potent. But the addictions continued on in various ways, and the awareness just became the foundation for me to explore it more.
It would be nice if one experience cured the whole thing, wouldn't it?
Would
It's
be
not
nice.
really how it works usually.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's not for me. I can't speak for everybody, but
yeah.
it wasn't that way for me.
So you didn't come in through traditional recovery. You didn't work in a recovery center where they were doing a 12-step method. You don't have that background as an addictions counselor. You came in through the work you're doing through the living inquiries and natural rest. And then quite a few years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, you published the book Natural Rest for Addiction.
Correct. Yeah.
That was kind of a summary of what had happened how you were working with people, which was a really groundbreaking work for a lot of us that were working with it and studying with it, and the DVD that came along with it. And now you've just published it again. There's a new version of it. What's your kind of key learnings in that 4 or 5 years?
The 4 or 5 years of having that book out,
Mm.
or having the center.
Well, both. The difference between, before you started the center and now.
Oh gosh.
I mean, I know that's a big,
Yeah.
that's a big question.
No, it's a great question though, because the working at the Kiloby Center has given me the opportunity to work with people who um, are in the depths of addiction to heroin and some of the, really, really potent addictions, and often right out of detox. And often really not open to mindfulness, which is what we do there, because they've never heard of it. And sometimes even scared to work with it, because what we do is we work so directly with trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And people tend to be avoidant. So what I had to do is I had to get really creative with it and find ways to make it accessible and digestible for people, simple, direct, applicable tools where people could start to see and feel freedom early on without having to learn any complicated skill set. And so it's been a process of just breaking it all down into simpler, more accessible ways for people. And also just this incredible learning curve around trauma and shame and deficiency stories, and how they all, and body contractions, and how they all play into it. Just the other day, I mean, I think one of the things that the Kiloby Center has shown me is that, so I don't want to speak in generalities, but generally speaking, if you are experiencing body contraction, if you have a history of addiction and you're experiencing body contraction, deficiency stories, trauma, fear, or shame, chances are the addiction is going to continue in some form. It may not be the original drug of choice, but it might switch to something else, switch tracks. And I think that you kind of have to brace yourself for that, and know that that's what's coming, until you start to really not only awake to that awareness, but also embody it and have it come all the way down in your body, where you're releasing all of that repressed emotion and body contraction. Then I think you can say that you're at a place where really addiction is becoming a faint memory. But until then, so I learned a lot about just, it's one thing to get people off drugs and alcohol. That's not actually terribly hard to do. You can detox them and give them some tools. The key is, can you, two, keep them off the drugs and alcohol? In other words, deal with the underlying issues. And the bigger thing is, can you help them on a much broader way, a broader sense of recovering from all the secondary addictions that pop up, and really working with the more deeply rooted stuff that's causing it all, in the first place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, the cravings are so situated in our bodies. One of the practices that you brought out about 3 years ago was thank you for arising, as a way to really welcome and pay attention to what's happening in our bodies. And I had always had this pulsing in my throat that was the signal for me to get ice cream. It was sweet, it was cool, it calmed that. And it wasn't until I did some deeper work on it that I realized that was actually coming from pain in the heart center. And it was coming up to the throat. And when I got into the heart center, then the whole throat thing disappeared. It's never come back.
Really?
Right. And so then I could deal with the pain in my heart center directly with that energy. And then over time, that's dissolved as well.
Beautiful.
And so that's how it works. We need to find a way to be present in our body with the energy.
Couldn't agree more. And you asked me what I've learned. It's like, just in my own process, the stomach was a similar thing for me. I had that heart opening too, but the stomach thing, until it was sort of dealt with, there was some momentum of addiction in some form in my life. And so I remember coming down into feeling, and so you don't know that at first, because until you have the present awareness to be able to see that that's what's going on, whether it's the throat or the stomach, you can often be very blind, and you can think that it's about the ice cream, or it's about, and then, so going down into my stomach, just remember working with that and seeing, wow, that has nothing to do with the thing that I'm addicted to, it has to do with the fear that I felt when I was a kid of feeling like I was not safe anymore. And then how that pattern reoccurred in my life, like getting bullied when I was 10, but then feeling the bully come back over and over. And all that was held in my stomach, along with a lot of shame. And as that started to release, it's like my whole body started to, like the engine that was driving that whole thing felt much more relaxed. And there's no way that you can know that until you experience it. You can't guess about how that's going to work until you go through it. And
Mhm.
again, like you said, it would be great if there was one switch. We could just turn that switch, and then, but
Yeah.
much more an exploration that unfolds.
One thing that I think is so interesting is the way that it works, the Velcro effect. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I love how specific it is. There's energy, and then maybe talk about mining as well, how we actually can be in our bodies and see what it is that's associated with that energy.
Yeah. So as you know, we talk about the Velcro effect as being the effect of when you have thoughts, words, or pictures, they feel fused with, or we say Velcro, stuck to emotions or sensations in the body. An example that I give is that if you think of something really innocuous that isn't really true about yourself, like if you're not a butcher in a shop and you say, I'm the worst butcher in the world, your body doesn't feel it. So it's a funny thought or a very light thought. But if you say something, or if your mind brings up something that feels closer to home, closer to really who you are, like, um, I'm the worst therapist ever, then if you feel something, that's the Velcro. That feeling or emotion is connected to that thought. So all of our work at the center and the living inquiries which facilitators do online is about undoing that Velcro so that when those thoughts come back, the feeling or the energy isn't connected to them, and there's freedom there. So yeah, that's the center of it. And we try to undo that in a whole bunch of different ways, but that's it.
So with trauma, there's a recognition now from a lot of leading trauma therapists and researchers that trauma is really stored in our body,
Yeah.
stored as energy in the body. So can you talk a little bit about, you said trauma and shame are the real underbelly of addiction. Can you talk about how you work with that at the center?
Yeah. How I work with it is how I worked with it on my own. So, and we're constantly doing it with people. So what we do is we come down to we have them bring their attention down to the area of the body that feels like it's at the source of that suffering or that pain or that addiction. And if they're very, very quiet and they're listening, not with their ears, but listening with awareness, we ask certain questions that elicit the material inside, the thoughts, the memories, the words that are actually velcroed to that. So it's a process of literally mining that stuff out. So if I sat here, like going back to the stomach thing, just since I was on that topic, when I went down to feel, what I felt was a stomach that was like doing this, like a restless engine.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Clenched fist, tight. Yeah.
and often was at the source of many of my cravings and discomfort and restlessness. But so as I went down there, the first thing I noticed is just the contracted feeling. I didn't know what really it was connected to, but as I sat quietly with it, I started to, and I started to ask some questions like, show me, show me more, or what is this really about? I started to see just the things in my life that I was presently afraid of. And for me, it was trauma because these people or these institutions were acting like bullies,
Mm-hmm.
because we all come across that energy, that bullying energy. And then, so I just sat with that and mined out each one of those pictures. It came in all sorts of different flavors, pictures, words. And then I traced it back and back, and then it was about, oh, it's about the bully in sixth grade, and then he comes up, and then just staying with it, and you can actually feel it happening. You can feel the Velcro undoing. It's an amazing. I know because as these pictures and words get mined out and they begin to dissolve in awareness, it's like the this thing, whatever it is in the stomach, starts to loosen. And it has an amazing ability to want to contract back. It wants to almost like it wants to find a reason to be afraid and contract back. But if you keep going very deeply into the energy and mining stuff out, it has no other choice than to begin to open. And then as it opens, there's that sort of newfound freedom on the bodily level. So I totally agree with the researchers who are saying this. I don't have a way of measuring if it's actually in our cells, because I'm not a scientist or research, but I can tell you after so many sessions that we just know experientially that's exactly what's happening, that in the body, there's a lot of unconscious memories, thoughts, and words and pictures that are Velcroed to these body sensations, and we actually see them coming up and releasing, and as they do, the energy, the body opens and releases. So we've seen it in our own work. We actually don't need the studies, but it's great that they're out there to reinforce what we're seeing.
Right. It's like how medical science right now is proving that 5,000 years of meditation is true.
Yeah.
It's nice to have that validation,
Yeah.
and it helps the skeptics to go, oh, well, maybe there is something to that.
Yeah, it does help. And with the Kiloby Center being a primarily mindfulness center, it's nice that science is catching up, because we've kind of, when we came into the space, people looked at us like, okay, but nobody does that. Nobody deals with just present moment awareness as the primary way. I was like, well, we're going to do this,
Right.
And eventually we started to see, and there already had been some research out, and now we're seeing it coming out more and more. So it's nice to have it validated. But
one of the big issues is that until people have the experience that they're safe to go into the energy in the body, people aren't really willing to do that because we're not too sure we're going to survive it. And we've been avoiding it with all kinds of ways. Certainly addiction is the main way for most of us. So how does that work? And we've talked before about willingness and recovery and readiness. How does that all work?
It's an enigmatic topic because everybody has a different degree of readiness. The thing that what the center is growing into, and it really is becoming more and more, is in a way a new treatment model based on unconditional love, and say it that way. So what does that mean? It means that as the therapists and the counselors and the facilitators work with people, part of their job is that they have to look at any sort of codependency or attachment to outcome or pressure or resistance to a client who isn't fully ready or who is avoidant. So what that does then, as the counselors and the therapists and all the staff become increasingly free of their own desire to change and get someone to be ready, what happens magically as those hands come off is that the person is given space to do it at a pace that works for them, and they don't feel that pressure, and it feels like acceptance, and it feels like love, and then there's no, again, so that's a beautiful thing that can happen, and we're exploring that because in the treatment space, that's not been the model for 4 years. The model has been, if you come in and you're avoidant, we're going to confront you on it. And so what we're understanding now is that people aren't just in treatment, planning how they're going to be non-compliant.
Right.
It's that way. Right? What they're dealing with are real emotions, fears, trauma, which their system is designed to protect them, from having to re-experience that.
Right.
So we understand that they're innocent. They're absolutely innocent of this. That it's not really a compliance issue as like it's a third grader acting out. It's simply that someone does not feel safe yet. So how do you make them feel safe? Well, you can't re-traumatize them. That's not safe. And you can't move them at a pace that they are not comfortable with, because that's not going to work. What you really have to do is you have to do your own inner work as a counselor so that you're free of all that desire to pressure and change and move somebody along and intervene and do this and give them the space. And I think that to me is the answer. And we know that from Al-Anon.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the Al-Anon literature, it's all about, learning how to let go of outcomes and let go of our addiction to fixing other people. And I just think it has to apply to Addiction Treatment Center equally.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people come into treatment and their deficiency stories got created because there were people in their life that were judging them and hurting them and attacking them and shaming them. Well, you don't want to have treatment. Do that, right? You want it to be something new, something different. So that's the only way. I mean, I think that's what makes people ready, but people are going to be ready at a pace that fits them. And everybody's going to be different. There'll be some people, we just had a client that came through that was just so ready to just work through issue after issue after issue. Just amazing freedom. And then we have another one who struggled at a much slower pace.
Right.
Each one of them exactly where they are.
Mm-hmm. When we're talking about our survival system and the nervous system, it's not something that's we can think about and we can think our way clear of that. It's something we have to directly feel. And so now we're at shame. So trauma and shame. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, you just referred to not judging people, unconditional love, and that's really the antidote.
Yeah. Yeah, shame. Hiding. One of the things about addiction is that we often hide, we often hide or lie or conceal who we are and feel guilty and shameful about who we are and what we've done. So really it's a lot like anything else that we do. So shame is felt in the body. It may be conscious where you can actually access it, but oftentimes it's much deeper. You have to go into the body and find those little pockets of unconscious stuff, like those memories of when you were 12 years old and you felt shamed about something or about who you were, and then let all that come up and just in real time continue to be aware of how we hide ourselves and how we feel shame in just everyday conversations and then create a space where it feels safe to be who we are, however that is, without being shamed for things that come up for us and just working with it. And like everything else, it starts to unravel, and it does differently. It unravels at a pace that's different for everybody. But as it does, there's an amazing amount of freedom just in that and no longer feeling that. And you can feel the difference when you go through that. I mean, you can, it's like you don't know what you have until it's gone is the song.
Yeah.
But this is a little different twist on it. You don't know what you're carrying around until it's gone because it's your operating system. So yeah, work with it in the same way. And then, just create an atmosphere where, I like to say to our staff that we really aren't any different than our clients because, at the staff meeting, I'll say, who on the staff has dealt or is dealing with an addiction? Everybody kind of raises their hand. Well, who's been avoidant towards trauma? Everybody raises their hand. Who has felt shame in their life? Everybody raises their hand. And after a while, you recognize what's the difference between us and the clients. And then, we are not in a position to shame them for or judge them for anything.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that's it's something that people really sense deeply when someone's coming from that top-down position, and when we're so sensitive to shame because it's so threatening, we get it right away. We don't have to have a lot of evidence. We can see it right. We can feel it right away when someone's feeling judgmental or shaming us. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's the work of all of us to do the inner work for ourselves. Because we can't control what other people do.
Mm-hmm.
If they're going to do that, we can't. But what we can do is work on ourselves, and we can encourage everyone to take that internal look at where is the shaming coming from. And quite often it's coming from their own shame or their own deficiency story or their own suffering, and they can't see that.
What do you see as the underlying reasons for addiction? Why do some people become addicted and others don't?
I would say that those studies that say that there's some genetic connection are probably partially correct. I think the prevailing wisdom now is that it's not sort of one thing, but it's a combination of things. And it has to do with, is there a genetic predisposition? What was your social, familial life growing up? We see a lot of people from broken homes, divorces, victims of abuse. So what happens to you during childhood and teenage years has a bearing on whether, I've heard that, it just activates the brain if the predisposition is there and you have the right or wrong atmosphere growing up. And then the culture of it. So if you grew up in a family where drinking is part of the culture of your family, or mom is addicted to Xanax, or then it's the social acceptability of it. Certainly, as we gather momentum in our addictions, the shame plays a part of it. The more shame I feel around my addiction, strangely, the more that I want to act out on the addiction to cover up the shame, which is a self-defeating cycle. And just as I've said before, deficiency stories. So really, if I were to say it's when it comes down to the therapeutic part, it's the shame, the trauma, fear, the deficiency stories. I'm worthless or I'm not good enough, that drive a lot of wanting to medicate that wound. It just makes a lot of sense. If I feel a certain way about myself and I have negative feelings about it, why wouldn't I want to reach for the beer or the wine or something to cover that up?
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And I think I'm hitting everything. The only thing I want to really impress upon people, this is the thing that we've really learned at the Kiloby Center, is that the body as a contracted thing in the very core is there's a sense of restlessness, and I don't know if it's just a part of being human, but as you sort of recognize that present awareness, you start to see that the body's doing this, and it has these repressed emotions or contracted energy. And I don't believe this is just my feeling. I don't have any studies behind this yet because they haven't gotten this far into the body. But I really think that you have to deal on the somatic level with that contracted feeling of separation. Really, it's a feeling of separation. That stomach, heart, throat, pelvic area, wherever it happens to be, that really has to be dealt with. And that's one of the underlying, I think it's one of the things that leads us, for those with a predisposition to addiction, those contractions are the way that we experience the craving and the wanting of relief.
Right. And does that energy, is that what drives a lot of the thinking? The thoughts are generated from that energy? What's your...
I never say that it's like the chicken or the egg. People have asked me that. So what I say is that there's the Velcro effect. They seem to rise together. So, and I don't know which one comes first. I've been sort of steered away from that question and just said, well, what do we know in our experiences that when you're feeling that contracted heart, you're also in a story. You're also seeing words and pictures. If you look at them, they're rising together. And that the opposite is true. If you're not feeling anything there, chances are your mind is quieter around something. So the opposite is true. That when one is, they have to kind of be together, really.
Mm-hmm. And they release together too.
Yeah.
As the energy releases, the thoughts release too. Yeah. So let's talk about families and people who love someone with addiction. What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, you know how I feel about that. I just went through a year-long case management and interventionist training to become a certified interventionist case manager. And it's all about intervening on the family, really. It's not so much intervening on the one who's, you're actually doing an intervention on someone who's abusing drugs or alcohol, but it's really about intervening on the family. A very enlightening experience of working with situations where the family thinks that they first of all, they think it's the addict with the problem. Okay, number one mistake, because what happens is that the family dynamic is part of what created the addiction in the person. Not to say it's the family's responsibility, but it's a family affair. So what we deal with in treatment is when we bring somebody in and we start working on trauma, it's almost always about mom and dad, brother, sister, mom, dad, uncle. So the family dynamic we know is playing a part in the creation of that addiction. And because that dynamic doesn't change throughout the years, it tends to stay in similar patterns. There's no way that the person can truly be free because they're experiencing the same sort of influence from family members. So that influence is there when the person is trying to get clean and recover. If the family hasn't healed their sort of internal things, all the members, and the person gets clean and sober, it can be very hard for that person to stay in recovery if they're meeting the same influences within the family. So really, everyone sort of has to heal. And one of the things that we're learning, I think we are all learning about addiction, is the more that you want someone to change, the less chance for them to actually change. And that is a hard lesson, because we think that our love for them must encompass a sort of force of will to make them. But if we examine that more deeply, it comes from our own insecurities and deficiency stories. And as you know, but we don't see that. And so we point outward. If he can just get better, then I'll be okay. But you don't have any evidence of that. You don't know. If he gets better, then you're mine, because if you still have that deficiency story, that internal struggle, it'll just turn towards something else or someone else, right? So to really heal, the whole family has to heal internally. And then, the atmosphere that makes people heal and makes people free is when everyone is doing their own internal work and freeing themselves from these limiting stories. And then it creates this sense of non-judgment, unconditional love and support. Boundary setting still is there.
Mm-hmm.
Setting boundaries, no longer enabling, being clear and direct but loving. And it's definitely a challenge to get families to that place, because there's so much resistance to the idea that it's a family.
Mm-hmm. And the fear, especially with opioids, the fear that someone's going to die really creates an intense environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people do die.
And people do die, yeah.
Yeah. It does create, and it makes people feel justified in their anxieties.
Yeah.
Right. But if you can really see in a moment, and the only way you can really see it is to go within and see what Velcro is going on for you, what stories are going on for you, you'll find, I think that you'll have the insight that the more I'm doing this, the less chance there's a way to support somebody and want them to be well without that energy.
Mm-hmm.
Because I can tell you, as someone who went through recovery, that energy doesn't feel like you think it does. It feels very forceful and judgmental and punitive. And so it can work to get someone in treatment maybe, but it doesn't work in the long run, because it's often some of the same patterns as before. But I don't remember your question exactly, other than to say, yeah, I mean, it does happen that people die. We know that. It's a tragic thing about this.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't change the fact that the family has to heal. That doesn't change the basic fact of that.
Right. And that level of fear and anxiety that the family are feeling is not helping. It's actually making it worse in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know that because you've done work with families.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I just a real quick, I mean, it's not uncommon for me to have a conversation with a mother, and I'll say, and she'll say, what should I do? And I'll say, I want you to take care of yourself. I want you to go and I want you to work with this person and really look at where all this is coming from, all this anxiety, and see if you can begin to release it and heal yourself. And it'll be the next question is, but how is he doing?
Right.
See, and it's almost like can't hear that.
Yeah.
So if there's one takeaway from this interview, please hear that. Like,
mm-hmm.
It's as much about you as the one that you're trying to save.
Right. So let's talk about the field of addiction recovery. It's got some pretty dismal statistics, and things are starting to shift in little pockets here and there. What do you see as really critical for the field to start having more genuine success and helping people really recover in a, not just an abstinence from drugs or alcohol, but in a deeper way?
In the beginning, when you have heroin addiction, it's a lot about, can we just keep somebody clean and sober for a while?
Mm-hmm.
So it's partly going to be medicine in the beginning for some people, like with the naltrexone implant, a little bit about maybe it's an implant that reduces or eliminates cravings for, could be several months up to a year. That window of opportunity is to get people off that drug and then to start dealing with the underlying issues can be one way. The other way we're doing it at the center is long-term care coordination. So after they leave treatment, we're still in touch with them on a regular basis. We're pointing them back to the mindfulness skills. We're pointing them to resources, and sometimes can be in their life for up to a year, not as that energy of you got to do this, do that, but as a support of, really helping them. So I think we need to see, the space needs to see that this is a lifelong thing for many people, that you don't go to treatment for 30 days and you're automatically cured. That's a myth that's been destroyed after 40 years of a low success rate based on that 30-day model. That 30-day model has been the model, and that has to die because it just has been a model that has failed. So being and supporting people in the longer term, educating people about what really addiction is all about. It's not about the drug or alcohol. There's underlying things there, and getting them interested and juiced up about the idea of real freedom, like not just clean and sober another day, but what does real freedom feel like in the mind and body, spiritual, and then that's where their readiness comes in. If you can light that fire where they're interested for their own sake, we got to do that for people.
Just before we go on, what is that real freedom? What can you give people a taste of that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in my experience, it's less shame.
Mm-hmm.
It's the things we've been talking about. It's when you start to experience the absence of shame, the absence of trauma, the absence of a deficiency story or stories. You start to, and you feel a lightness in your being. Like you could say you feel present, but it's more than just presence. You actually, on the bodily level, you feel lighter. And you feel more able to just be yourself, like whatever that is. You show up as yourself, and being able to express your wants and needs and not feel bad about that. And learning how to love, but that doesn't mean like the sticky kind of love where, you're, but more of just a simple, open, in some ways not attached love, is what it looks like for me. And then just remaining open, because there's always more to see. In my life, there's more to see. And that's what it looks like for me.
How can we move from this, 10% success rate out of the 30-day? How are we going to do that? It seems like there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of social ideas. It's complicated.
Yeah. It is complicated because the insurance companies, not to put all of them in a basket, but here in the States, is that they're not supportive of long-term recovery. And I understand, because their business model has to do with the bottom line. But when you're talking about something that impacts somebody's life over the course of time, it's a chronic situation. For any of us to continue supporting the idea that you go somewhere for 30 days and miraculously you get everything you need in that 30 days is a dead model, right?
Right.
So we have to figure out ways to support each other. I think one of the things is just to help those who have to pay the cost of this is to support people, not to keep them in treatment forever, because that becomes financially undoable, but find ways to support each other, peer support. There's a magic thing that happens when people get together and they're all working towards that same sort of freedom, and they're just supporting each other, like in aftercare groups, and there's all sorts of things that we do and others do just to get people interested where they're not in treatment but they're supported. The costs are certainly a situation. Finding ways to help people who are uninsured or underinsured, it's a challenge, but that needs to happen. That's what comes to mind mostly.
And the Kiloby Center is certainly part of that. The innovative methods that you're using, a lot of which people can take home with them. They can do it through aftercare, and that, my sense is that when people turn that corner and they are able to stay present with what's going on and they're not scared of themselves anymore, then everything shifts.
Everything shifts. And we're also conscientious of cost too, because one of the things, like 80% of our aftercare is just totally free.
Right.
It's totally free.
Mm-hmm.
there's a part like when you start to engage a facilitator to continue to do sessions, that facilitator has to be paid for their work. We're trying to make it accessible and you know, and help with the cost. But the other thing that you just said is if we can just give them a little bit of support that doesn't, you know, kill their pocketbook, a little bit of support for a year just to get that fire started so that they have all the tools they need, and then they start really going inward on their own. We're trying to do that. We're building skills at the Kiloby Center and constantly, you know, creating evaluating those skills and helping people with those skills, because we really want to set them on a course for them to be, you know, unfolding in that freedom for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've really seen that emphasis on self-facilitating and building those skills and tools for people. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I mean, it's been invaluable in my life. I mean, if I had to rely on somebody else to help me every day in the last 13 years of my recovery, I mean, it's not doable.
Right. Yeah. And so much of that we can do for ourselves too.
Yeah.
We're not hopeless losers.
Right.
Yeah. So the last question then is, somebody's listening or watching this and they have a problem with addiction and they want to get some help. What's your suggestions for what people could do next?
It's a good question. If you're using drugs or alcohol, you're going to want to consider detoxing first, with under the care of a physician or a detox center, because it can be very dangerous to try to do. Not only is it dangerous in terms you could have a seizure or even die if you don't do it right, but also the chance, the success of just doing it on your own. People often try to get off drugs and alcohol repeatedly on their own and are not successful. So be detoxed. And then whether you need treatment somewhere is really up to you. You have to kind of take an honest look and bounce that off people who care about you, who might see things that you don't see. And then picking the right treatment center or way of recovery, you want to find something that resonates with who you are and what your worldview is. You know, if Christianity is your path and that's where you want to go, if counseling is the way, if mindfulness is the way, whatever, find something that resonates. And yeah, and just know you're in for a hell of a ride, you know, good and bad, right? You're in for tremendous freedom, and also you're going to experience pain and struggle along the way.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been interesting, and I'm quite familiar with the Kiloby Center and the work, and I'm always happy to hear you talk about it because you make it so simple and so radical in the effects that this kind of recovery can actually have. Go to kilobycenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.